Welcome back, troops. So let's tab 59. So if you break the law in the military, you could well find yourself banged up in a place called the MCTC, the Military Corrective Training Centre. Now, the UK military is quick to point out that this is not a prison. You're detained at a military corrective and training centre, not a prison. But for all intents and purposes it is, isn't it? It's a place down in Colchester in Essex in the south of England. And formerly, back in World War II, it was originally a prisoner of war camp. But once that had finished, it became a military prison, if you like. I'm going to use the word prison. And an old saying, an old sort of slang saying in the military, used to be the glass house. If you'd done something wrong, you got put in the glass house. Now that didn't come, that word, that phrase, the glass house, didn't come from being in the military prison at Colchester. I'll tell you where it comes from later. Well, that was a nickname, you're in the glass house. So, there's three sort of categories of detainees at the Military Corrective Training Centre. You've got the category of soldier or sailor or airman, it's tri-service, it's male and female obviously. You've got the detainees that could be in there from anything from 14 days detention up to 2 years and then soldier on. So in other words, you do your crime, you get nicked, you get your sentence between 14 days, that's the minimum you can serve there, up to 2 years, that's the maximum you can do in the Military Corrective Training Centre. So you're going to do that sentence, and then at the end of that sentence, you'll go back to your unit and carry on soldiering. Soldier on after collie. That's what we used to call it when I was in. Someone done a bit of time, he was in Collie or Colchester. So he's just come back from Collie. He's done a bit of time in Colchester. Everyone knew then that he'd been in the army, Nick. The other category, the second category of prisoner, are those that are going to be discharged once they've finished their sentence. In other words, the military system, the military establishment doesn't want you anymore. You're going to do your sentence and then you're out, son. You're out in Civvy Street. And the final category are people that are being detained, awaiting investigation for their crimes, alleged crimes, or they are awaiting placement in a civilian prison, an HMP, His Majesty's Prison, or His Majesty's Young Offenders Institution, depending on their age. So that's the three sort of basic categories of prisoner or detainee that we have in our only corrective training centre, Military Corrective Training Centre, which is in Colchester. But it wasn't always the case. So originally, back in, quick refer to my notes because I can't remember the exact dates, back in Aldershot, our first military prison was 1856 in Aldershot, and it was basically just a barracks, a wooden hutted barracks that had a bit more security perimeter around it. That was in 1856, but in 1864 it was realised that that wasn't sufficient. They needed a proper prison, not just wooden huts. I don't know why, maybe people were escaping, but they had a report. They did a report and said in 1864 and said, no, we need a new prison. A new one was built in 1870. Now this is where the term glass house comes from. In 1870, at Aldershot, when they built this new big purpose brick building prison, it had a very large glass lantern style roof. Don't know why, just the design of the day, I suppose. So this massive glass roof, and that's where the name glass house come from. Some people think it came from the word glass, or terminology for glass house, was because everything was highly polished to a mirror finish, and therefore the whole place looked like it was made of glass, it was shiny, but it wasn't. It was the Aldershot prison that had a large glass roof. Now that prison carried on for ages, a long time we had that prison, and in fact in 1946, so just after the Second World War, it was housing between 400 and 500 prisoners. Now that's double what it was designed to take. Massive overcrowding in Aldershot Prison. Now at that time, just after World War II, 1946, many of those prisoners were in prison, been detained because of offences they'd committed during the Second World War. And they felt in 1946 they were still serving their time. Hang on, the war's over. Why are we still banged up? You know, the war's over, everyone's being demobbed. We should be released as well. So that thought that they had, plus the overcrowding, led to massive riots in Aldershot Prison. And the prisoners went ape. They started throwing stuff off the roof, not the glass roof, there's other roofs there as well, and smashing the place up generally. And I think they set fire to it as well. And when they had doused the fire out, the high pressure water hoses had caused so much damage to the building that it was scrapped. And in fact, it was demolished in 1958, the Aldershot Prison, and that was the end of that. Now, before we had the MCTC, the Military Corrective Training Centre, the one I was talking about in Colchester, and we had the Aldershot one, but we also had other military prisons dotted around, not that many. You've got to remember as well that pretty much every battalion or regiment during the war would have had barracks, obviously, in this country, and some overseas. And most of those barracks, well, all of the barracks would have had a guard room. And more often than not, the guard room would have a few purpose-built holding cells. And people would do lesser crime service, lesser detention in there. I think it's up to 28 days. And even after World War II, in my time, out in Germany and other places, regiments had a guard room, like I was saying, there'd be a few cells at the back, and you could get up to 28 days imprisonment in those guard room cells. But we still had these other prisons throughout history, not just the one at Aldershot. We had one up in North Yorkshire, North Hallerton. Now North Hallerton, that was built in 1788 as a civilian prison. And it was a civilian prison up until 1922, when it closed down for whatever reason. World War II comes along and breaks out, and in 1943 it becomes a military prison. It actually, before it became a prison in 1943, it was used as a storage facility for the military, and also it was a RMP, Royal Military Police. They had a training establishment there as well. But in 43 it became a military prison, and it remained a military prison all through the Second World War. And again, very similar to Aldershot, in 1946, same sort of detail. The prisoners in there, the war's over. Come on, let us out now, we've done our time, the war's over. They weren't released initially, and so they rioted as well and smashed the place up. And eventually, in 1964, it was no longer a military prison. It was handed back to the civil authorities and become again HMP North Hallerton. And it was actually, when it was taken over by the civilian authorities in 1964, it was a young offenders institute, holding young offenders, a bit like a Borstal, I suppose. And that didn't close down until 2013 as a prison. And I think now it's going to be a housing development. That's the plan for that one. Now another one we had down in Somerset, HMP, His Majesty's Prison, Shepton Mallet. Now, talking about ghosts on one of my previous videos, apparently HMP Shepton Mallet is one of the most haunted prisons in the United Kingdom. So what's the story behind Shepton Mallet? Well, that was built in 1625, so it's a real old gaff. And it was a civilian prison up until the start of World War II in 1939, when it was taken over by the military. Initially, it was taken over by the British military, but soon after that, the United States Armed Forces took it. I think in 1943, the United States forces took it over. And while they had control of the military prison, they built an execution block. Most of the executions then were hanging, but they did use firing squads as well. And there's some very thick walls in Shipton Mallet. If you ever look at it online, you can have a decent look at it. So they had it, the American military had it as a military prison for their personnel up until the end of the war. And then it was taken over by the British military again, who kept it as a military prison until 1966. And then again, it was handed back to the British civilian authorities. And that one didn't close till 2013 either. So there's a few examples there of military prisons in the United Kingdom. As I say, we don't refer to our only military prison as a prison. It's a military corrective and training centre. In fact, I'm sure there's some veterans watching this that either knew somebody that served time at Colchester at Collie, the glass house, as it was called, or they might have served a bit of time in it themselves. This call sign, never done anything bad enough to get sent to Colchester. But I did know people that went there and came back and soldiered on. And many of them came back super fit, super well trained. From what I understand, and again, I don't know, I never served time there. From what I understand, a lot of these soldiers were coming back from doing their time in Colchester as a better soldier. So maybe the corrective retraining side of it at Colchester works, because they came back fit, done their time, and a lot of them went on to get promoted. It was like going through basic training again. And it must have been a bit of a culture shock, you know, for guys and girls that do time at Colchester, because if they're taking you back through military training, you know, you might have been a Royal Navy personnel that had very sort of limited experience of basic soldier-like military training. Same maybe with some of the RAF trades and even some of the army trades. And there you are, doing up to 2 years in the Military Corrective Training Centre at Colchester, and you're just being bashed through basic training, drill, PT, low-level tactics, weapons training, stuff that you might not have touched for years, and when you did, you'd only just scratch the surface of that particular training. So it'd be interesting to hear from anyone that might have gone through that. You must have come out of there a bit of a culture shock. Of course, like I say, some personnel do their sentence there at Military Corrective Training Centre, and then were discharged. Now, when I was in Germany, in my time out in Germany, it was illegal in the British military to be homosexual. And if you were caught as a homosexual in those days, you were banged up in Colchester. And I knew a couple of guys that went from my regiment to Colchester. I don't know how long they got sentenced for there, but afterwards they were kicked out of the military. Obviously that's completely wrong, and thankfully it's been rectified nowadays. But back then in the 80s, if you got caught, you'd end up going to Colchester and then being discharged. There was no hope of being sentenced at Colchester for a term and then being sent back to your regiment. It was a big no-no. I think same with drugs. I think if you were caught with drugs, your sentence would be X amount of months or maybe years in detention at Colchester and then discharged, no chance of soldiering on. I'm not sure how they decided, the military court system, whether you would soldier on or be discharged after your sentence. I don't think you got a choice either. Of course, while you're serving time in military corrective centres, prisons, let's call them prisons, even if you were serving time in your own guard room cells, while you were in there, your pay stopped. And also what stopped was your time served. So in other words, if you'd signed on for 3 years service and you'd done 2 years service and then you got 1 year's detention, your time stopped. So if you were soldiering on, when you finished that year's sentence, you had to redo that year to complete your 3 years. I think there was, when I say there was no pay, you didn't get paid, I think you got a certain amount of allowance. Now, I don't know how it worked for military personnel that were married, whether there's any sort of help for the wife or family while the soldier or sailor or airman was doing time. That's something I have to look into. Maybe someone out there knows the answer to that. Maybe someone out there is watching this and they actually worked in the Military Corrective Training Centre. You'd know a lot more about it than I do. It'd be interesting to hear your comments. So please, if you fit into those categories, if you've done time there either as a prisoner or a detainee, or you've done time there as one of the staff, be very interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'm sure we all would. So keep the stories coming. Well, that's it then. A bit about being banged up, a bit about the glass house, a bit about Collie, Colchester, Military Corrective Training Centre in Essex. If you're new to my channel and you haven't subscribed, please consider it. I'm not saying do it, I'm saying consider it. Thanks for all your support, guys. You're absolute stars out there. I love the comments you send in. I do read them all. Can't answer them all, I really can't. But I answer as many as I can, even if I only give you a thumbs up. And I certainly do read all your comments. So that's it. I'm going to tab on now. Till the next time, troops, and it won't be long. Remember, stay safe and let's tab.